Thank you. Thanks, Azim.
All right, man.
Great.
It's gonna be really
Pleasure. Last talk, right? Last talk. So AI, whatever we mean by it, is certainly going places, but exactly where is it going? I mean, one possibility is that AI will help us become better stewards of ourselves, our future, our world, and the life we share it with. But then there are all these other weird dystopian scenarios. Perhaps we'll drown in a sea of paperclips due to a value misalignment problem, or become enslaved by our robotic overlords in the future. Now, I don't give these particular future scenarios that much credence, but it's interesting to ask where the notions come from. And one of the things that gooses up these dystopian notions is the idea that the pace of change is itself changing very quickly. As dizzying as things seem to be changing now, right now is the slowest pace of change that we will ever experience. When you stand on an exponential curve, the view behind looks flat and the view ahead is almost vertical. That's the exponential view. Thank you, Azim, for that. And many things drive our intuitions about the implications of this pace of change. And the thing I want to focus on today is my main area of research, which is consciousness. But what is consciousness? Well, consciousness is the presence of any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. For a conscious organism, a conscious creature, there is something it is like to be that creature. There is nothing it is like to be this floor or this table, but there is something it is like to be me or you. Consciousness is also, if you think about it, it's the only thing that really matters. Without consciousness, there's no world, there's no self, there's no pain, there's no pleasure, there's no hope, there's no despair, there's nothing at all. Whatever we do, and whether we think something is good or bad or morally a good thing or morally repugnant, we think this and do this only because of its effect on the conscious experience of someone or something now or in the future. And consciousness is also one of our greatest remaining mysteries. And the philosopher David Chalmers puts it like this. I just want to read you the last bit of this quote. He says, consciousness, it is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. And indeed, the combined activity of about 90 billion neurons in your brain and 1,000 times more connections. Each one of these neurons, a tiny biological machine, is giving rise to a conscious experience, your conscious experience, right here and right now. And if this biological machine inside your brain can give rise to a conscious experience, then what about some future machine? Is there a track from artificial intelligence towards artificial consciousness? And by artificial intelligence here, I don't mean a kind of jazzed up spreadsheet or regression algorithm, the kinds of things that sometimes pass for artificial intelligence. But I'm thinking of something more like the character Ava from Alex Garland's brilliant film, Ex Machina. Would it be the case, will there come a time when, for some future technology, we are able to say with confidence that there is something it is like to be that thing? And if machines like this are conscious, then not only does that change how they influence us, but we would also have ethical obligations towards them, just as we have ethical obligations to anything that has the capacity to suffer. Now, it's tempting to think that consciousness and intelligence go together, that consciousness emerges once a particular level of intelligence is reached. But why do we think this? Well, one reason we think this, I think, is that us humans, we tend to think of ourselves at the center of everything, on the top of every pile, and the apex of every pyramid. We are intelligent, we are conscious, so these things must go together because it's what makes us special. But this is a kind of pernicious and persistent anthropocentrism that has misled us before. Think about Copernicus. We're not at the center of everything. And the other reason we commonly assume this is this idea that the brain is a kind of computer and that consciousness is a property of the software or mindware that's running on the wetware of the brain. And the idea here is that consciousness is a form of information processing. Now, some forms of intelligent behavior are very well described by information processing. A computer that's playing Go actually really is playing Go. But not everything is like this. A computer simulation of a storm, for instance, it doesn't get rainy and wet and windy inside the computer. By the way, this was a summer holiday in North Devon 2 years ago, for those of you who enjoy British summer holidays. There are some things for which a simulation is the same thing as an instantiation, and there are other things for which that is not the case. So what kind of thing is consciousness? Is it the kind of thing, is it inextricably tied up with intelligence, and is it just a matter of the right kind of information processing? So what I want to suggest this afternoon is that consciousness actually has much more to do with being alive than it has to do with being smart. And to understand why, we have to ask what brains are actually for. Brains didn't evolve to play Go or write AI programs, machine learning. Brains evolved, and the functions that brains enable all evolved with a fundamental imperative to keep the organism alive. The history of brains on this planet and the history of consciousness itself is a history of moment-to-moment avoidance of dying. So at the center of this story is the idea of the brain as a prediction machine. Now just imagine being a brain. You're stuck inside a bony skull. There's no sound inside the brain. There's no light either. And you're trying to figure out what's out there in the world, if there's anything out there. All the brain gets are noisy and ambiguous sensory signals, which are only indirectly related to things in the world, whatever they may be. So perception, figuring out what's there, has to be a kind of process of informed guesswork in which the brain combines these ambiguous sensory signals with its prior expectations or best guesses about what's out there in the world. And that's what we perceive. The brain doesn't hear sound or see light. What we consciously perceive is the brain's best guess of what's out there. Now let me give you a couple of examples. Now you might have seen this before, but I want you to think about it in a slightly different way. This is called Adelson's checkerboard. How many people are familiar with Adelson's checkerboard? Quite a few, but not everybody. Now if you look at the two patches A and B there, they should appear to be very different shades of grey, right? I hope everybody can see that. They look different. They are, in fact, the exact same shade of grey, and I can illustrate that by putting another version and joining the two patches together, and you can see it's the same shade of grey. There's no discontinuity. If you think I'm cheating, I'll just move this bar across, and you can see it's the same shade of grey. Take it away, and they look different again. Now what's going on here is the brain is using its prior knowledge that you're not aware of having, that's built deep into the visual cortex, that a cast shadow dims the appearance of a surface so that you will see B as lighter than it really is. Here's another example which shows just how quickly the brain can use new predictions to change what you consciously experience. I need sound for this next example. Let's see if it's there. Have a listen. If you've heard this before, then don't say anything. If you haven't heard this before, try to figure out what animal this is. Okay, listen. Any idea what animal that is? Dolphin? Listen one more time. Okay, now listen to this.
I think Brexit is a really terrible idea.
Now have a listen to what I played you before. I'm going to play exactly the same thing I played, but now you have just heard that phrase. Okay, so now, this is called sine wave speech, and now you should probably be able to hear words in what previously just sounded like a bunch of random noisy whistles. I can't unhear it anymore, so I'm never sure whether it works. And what's remarkable here, because the sensory information coming into your brain hasn't changed at all. Now, all that's changed is your brain's best guess of what caused that sensory information, and that changes what you consciously hear. Now, thinking of things this way, just want to drive it home, drive the message home, if anyone out there is listening. This does change in quite a fundamental way how we think about how the brain accomplishes perception. There's a kind of classic straw man view in which sensory signals come into the brain through the retina and the other sensory surfaces and progress deeper and deeper into the cortex. And as they get further and further into the cortex, they're processed in more sophisticated ways. So the early stages deal with things like luminance and edges and light, and higher or deeper stages deal with complex things like faces and places. And this is a monkey visual system, so we have monkey faces here. Now, the idea of the brain as a prediction engine changes this around completely. Instead of perception depending primarily on sensory signals coming into the brain from the outside, it depends just as much, if not more, on perceptual predictions flowing in the other direction. We don't just passively perceive our world, we actively generate it. Perception depends as much on things from the inside out as from the outside in. Here's one more example of how we can think of perception as this process of prediction. Now, this is a very classic, deep convolutional neural network of the sort of thing that you have been hearing about a lot the last couple of days. This is a very famous one that actually can be trained to classify whether a dog is present in any image. You show images, tells you what dog is there. But what you can do is you can run it backwards. So basically, you take an image, whether or not there's a dog there, and then you run it backwards and update the image until the network is satisfied that there's a dog in the image. So you're making the network predict or make a self-fulfilling prediction that the image contains a dog. And so we did this with after taking a panoramic video, and we get something like this. So welcome to Sussex campus on a Tuesday afternoon. This is where I work. And what we've done here is combine this technique, which is called the Google Deep Dream algorithm, to this panoramic video. And people will put the headset on, and it's an Oculus headset. They can look around, and they have a very strange experience. And what we've done is try to simulate what happens when the brain has very powerful predictions to see dogs everywhere. And there are a few too many dogs going on here. Now, the similarity of this kind of experience is probably familiar to some of us. It's not radically different from the kind of experience associated with certain kinds of altered states, but even also psychosis of particular kinds. And think about this for a minute, because if hallucination like that is a kind of uncontrolled perception, then perception right here and right now is also a kind of hallucination, but it's a controlled hallucination in which the brain's predictions are continually being reined in by sensory signals coming from the world. In fact, you could say that we are all hallucinating all the time. It's just that when we agree about our hallucinations, that's what we call the real world. Now I'm going to tell you that this also applies to our experience of being a self. Now, this seems weird because visual illusions might deceive our eyes, but how could I be deceived about what it is to be me? The experience of being a self seems so familiar, so unified, and so continuous that it's difficult not to take it for granted, but we shouldn't take it for granted. The self is not the thing that does the perception. The self is a perception. It's another kind of controlled hallucination generated by the brain. In fact, there are many different ways we can experience being a self. There's the bodily self, the experience of being a body and of having a body, this thing that exists in the world that's me. There's the experience of perceiving the world from a particular first-person point of view. There are experiences of intending to do things and of being the cause of things that happen. When people talk about free will, this is often what they talk about. And then there are experiences of being a continuous and distinctive person over time, built from a rich set of memories and social interactions. This is where the I and your name comes in. Now, neurologists know very well, and in the lab we can do this too, we can tear apart these different aspects of self. They can come apart in all sorts of different ways. So the experience of being a unified, continuous self is just another kind of construction, fragile construction that depends on the brain. So let's return to the bodily self. How does the brain generate this experience of being and having a particular body? Well, just the same principles apply. The brain makes its best guess about what is and what is not part of the body. Now, there's a beautiful experiment which illustrates this, and some of you might be familiar with this experiment. This is called the rubber hand illusion, and I keep coming back to this. It illustrates it very well. In the rubber hand illusion, which I think was the only neuroscience experiment really pioneered at a dinner party somewhere, a person's real hand is hidden from sight behind that partition, and a fake rubber hand is placed in front of them. Then the experimenter strokes both hands simultaneously with a paintbrush while the person focuses their attention on the fake hand. Now, for most people, after a short while, you get the uncanny feeling that the fake hand is somehow part of your body. And the idea is that seeing touch and feeling touch on an object that looks like a hand and is roughly where a hand should be is enough evidence for the brain to reach its best guess that the fake hand is, in fact, part of the body. Now, you can test this like that, which is by far the best way to test these kinds of illusions, especially at science festivals. But no, you can test it in all sorts of ways, but I don't think it's pretty clear from the guy's reaction that he's assimilated the fake hand somehow as part of his body. You can extend this. How about being in somebody else's body, looking at yourself from the outside? Now, we set this up at the British Science Festival last September. Here, two people wear headsets. The headsets have cameras on, and you swap the feed. They look at each other, and when they shake hands, providing this critical multisensory stimulation, there is the uncanny feeling that you're shaking hands with yourself from somebody else's perspective. So what this means is that experiences of what is our body and where we are in space are just different kinds of controlled hallucinations. Now, there's one more thing I want to mention, which is experiences of self aren't just about having a body. There is also this quite basic, somehow difficult to describe because it's always their experience of simply being a living organism, simply being a body. And this highlights interoception. Now, interoception, it's not introspection. Interoception are all the ways the brain senses and regulates the internal state of the body, things like blood pressure, heart rate, gastric distension, all these things. And interoception, a lot of the brain is devoted to this process. And although it's a little bit overlooked in neuroscience, we tend to think of vision. Everybody focuses on vision. Interoception is massively important because it's perception and regulation of the body. That's what keeps us alive. Now, here's another version of the rubber hand illusion. In this version from our lab at Sussex, what we did was we had a virtual hand, and it flashes red and back very gently, either in time or out of time, with the person's heartbeat. And what we find is when it flashes in time with the heartbeat, they feel the virtual hand more as part of their body than when it flashes out of time with their heartbeat. So our experiences of embodiment depend not only on signals coming from the outside, but also signals coming from deep within the body. The experience of embodiment the experience of being a body is a deeply embodied phenomenon. And here's where I think the relevance of being a living organism comes in. Now, perception of the body from within isn't about figuring out what's there. It's not about deciding whether there's a chair and an object. It's about control and regulation, keeping important physiological quantities within the tight ranges that are compatible with survival. Think of it this way. A thermostat in your house can regulate the temperature. When it gets too hot, it turns the heating off. When it gets too cold, it turns the heating on. Now, a better kind of thermostat would predict when the temperature was going to change and alter the heating in advance so that it didn't have to wait for a disturbance before compensating for it. And this is exactly what's going on in the brain. By continually predicting the future state of the organism in terms of all the physiological quantities that have to be preserved, the brain is much better able to keep these things in the ranges they need to be in. This happens even when you do something simple like stand up. When you stand up, your brain is anticipating the changes in blood pressure and all sorts of other things, and compensating for them, because otherwise you would faint. So the key idea is that predictive perception of any kind is fundamentally shaped by the need to control and regulate the interior of the body. And if you follow this idea all the way through, you can start to see that all of our conscious experiences, since they all depend on the same principles of prediction, are all shaped by this basic drive to stay alive. We experience the world around us and ourselves within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. So let me bring things together step by step. What we consciously see depends on the brain's best guess of the causes of sensory input. The rubber hand illusion shows that this applies also to our experience of what is and what is not our body. And then experiences of being a body also depend critically on sensory signals coming from deep inside the body. And finally, basic experiences of being a body have more to do with control and regulation than with figuring out what's there. So our experiences of the world around us and of ourselves within it are different kinds of controlled hallucinations designed by evolution to keep us alive in worlds full of danger and opportunity. And this is why I think consciousness has more to do with life than with intelligence. At the very least, understanding the nature of our conscious experiences requires understanding how the mechanisms of perception are continually shaped by these fundamental biological imperatives for survival. But it may also be that it's life and not intelligence that provides the necessary conditions for consciousness. Consciousness may not just be a matter of information processing, a thing that can be simulated. It could be that a conscious machine must be a living machine. Now, René Descartes, perhaps more than anybody, has shaped how we think about the relations between mind and matter and brain and body. And he believed that humans had a rational soul, an immaterial essence that set us apart from the rest of the natural world and its messy reality. For Descartes, non-human animals were just beast machines, machines made of flesh and blood that lacked this essential spirit or soul that gave humans the ability to experience anything and a special place in the mind of God. Now, the story I've been telling is rather the opposite. Our conscious selfhood, and perhaps the machine soul of any future AI, arises not in spite of, but because of our nature as beast machines. And just as with Copernicus before us, and then Darwin later on, realizing this just helps us understand better that we are not apart from nature, we are part of nature, and that has to be a good thing. Thank you very much.